success of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms has left both fans and HBO themselves with a difficult situation to navigate in terms of the show's long-term future. With the acclaim of Season 1 and Season 2 now in production, it seems very likely the show will also get a third season. If that does come to pass, that would mean HBO had adapted the 3 published novellas, The Hedge Knight, The Sworn Sword, and The Mystery Knight. We will then reach a crossroad in which HBO, showrunner Ira Parker, and of course George R. R. Martin himself will have to decide if to carry on the show past the 3 published novellas. If you'd asked me prior to watching Season 1, I would have been very against this idea, given the issues Game of Thrones faced when they stopped adapting book material, especially when they moved past the published books. You also have House of the Dragon facing its own challenges, for similar but albeit different reasons. I very much believed that the best thing for the show would be to stop after Season 3. But here's the thing, I've been extremely impressed with the quality of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms Season 1, the quality of the writing, and the love Ira Parker has for the story. Like all adaptations, things did change a bit from page to screen, but for me, it's the most faithful adaptation of A Song of Ice and Fire since Season 1 of Game of Thrones. It's very clear why George R. R. Martin loved the show so much, because of how well written, directed, and hell even acted it was. I have to admit, the idea of it ending so soon does sadden me, but if recent interviews with Ira Parker and even George R. R. Martin are to be believed, there's a very real possibility that A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms will try and carry on past the published novellas. In this video, we're going to break down how they might do this, what we know about the outlines for future novellas that George has given Ira Parker, and if Ira's dream of following the whole lives of Dunk and Egg is even realistically possible. Ira Parker has stated in several interviews while doing promo for Season 1 that George had given him 12 outlines for as of yet unpublished Dunk and Egg novellas. We know that George had outlines for at least 2 more novellas, likely more, for at least a decade now. But it was during these interviews with Ira we got a firm number, that being 12. Out of these 12 novellas, we know a fair amount about 2 of them, and at least the draft names for a further 4. In terms of the scope of the story, in a blog post as far back as 2012, George made it very clear he intended the stories to cover the whole lives of Dunk and Egg, and he specifically mentioned the Peak Uprising and the tragedy at Summerhall as events he wanted to cover, Summerhall being the likely conclusion of the story. Using this information and what we know about the established lore around Dunk and Egg, we can kind of work out what some of these other outlines will cover, and in some cases make a good educated guess given the timeline of events. The 2 outlines we know the most about are the She-Wolves of Winterfell and the Village Hero. We know that George began writing She-Wolves soon after the publication of The Mystery Knight in 2010, and in the years that followed, he talked openly about the project. It seemed it was intended to be published in the anthology book Dangerous Women, but when it became clear in 2013 he wasn't going to finish the story in time, it was replaced in the anthology by The Princess and the Queen, with The Princess and the Queen and, well, The Rogue Prince, published in 2014, going on to be expanded into Fire and Blood. From what little George has talked about the novella, mostly in blog posts, we know it's set in Winterfell, likely a few months after the events of the Mystery Knight. According to George, Sir Duncan the Tall and Egg will meet these so-called She-Wolves, a group of formidable Stark wives, widows, mothers, and grandmothers. According to report from some fans attending convention panels, 4 of these She-Wolves may be widows of previous Lords of Winterfell, and 1 the current Lady Stark, whose husband, Beron Stark, is dying from a wound taken while fighting the Ironborn. There may be a House Stark succession crisis, a struggle for power amongst these Stark ladies, possibly on behalf of their children, of which there were at least 10 at the time. Additionally, Martin mentioned this story in connection with the fact there has never been a ruling Lady of Winterfell at another convention panel. The other story we know George has begun work on, to some degree at least, is the Village Hero. We know the story is to be set in the Riverlands, but that's all the firm details we really have. Some fans speculate the village in question could be Pennytree, the home of Dunk's mentor Sir Arlen, given it would make sense Dunk would visit the place Arlen had told him so much about, especially if, say, he was heading north. Now, there is some question as to what one of these novellas is the fourth and fifth story. As George R. R. Martin has stated, he doesn't actually know which of them will be finished first. He claims he will not know more about completing either novella until he has finished The Winds of Winter, which, well, the least said the better. Many fans believe that while She-Wolves has had the most work done and may actually release first, that Village Hero might have originally intended to be the fourth story, given it would make sense that Dunk and Egg would need to pass through the Riverlands to get north, the setting of She-Wolves. Therefore, it's speculated that George only began working on She-Wolves over Village Hero in order to fit with the publication of Dangerous Women. At the same time, however, as of 2014, George has also suggested that the story of all the novellas remains only roughed out in his head, and he has also notes and ideas for additional novellas in the series, which may be finished out of chronological order, which makes sense given the debate around She-Wolves or Village Hero is the fourth novella. One change since 2014, however, is given that we know that George has given Ira Parker outlines for 12 more stories, suggests these ideas are no longer just roughed out in his head, but developed enough to actually write down to give Parker something to actually work with. We also know the working titles of some of the other stories that George has been working on. However, all we can really discern from this is a vague idea of what the novellas could be about, given what's already been established in the A Song of Ice and Fire history and lore. The champion could mean one of several things. It could be as simple as Dunk actually winning a tourney. Another idea is he's the champion for the crown during Lionel Baratheon's trial by combat during his rebellion after Egg's son Duncan broke a marriage pact to marry Lionel's daughter. The Kingsguard. While we have no idea what this story could be, given we know that Duncan eventually joins the Kingsguard, I suspect this novella may document how, or at the very least, the very start of Dunk's time as a member of the Kingsguard. The same logic applies to the Lord Commander. It may tell the story of Dunk becoming the Lord Commander, or his first few weeks as the Lord Commander. However, given what we know about the events at Summerhall and the use of the phrase Lord Commander in the fragmented accounts of Maester Corso, suggests this could actually be the setting of the story, especially given that we know this is an era that George wants to cover. If that was the case, it would most likely be the final novella, given, well, what happens at Summerhall. The Sellsword is the only outline title that I think is a bit of a mystery. It's kind of hard to pin down what this could potentially be about. Some fans speculate that perhaps Dunk and Egg might actually head to Essos, maybe to bring back Aerion from his exile before the third Blackfyre Rebellion, given that we know that Aerion was a part of a sellsword company for a short time. That's all we know about the outlines that George has talked about publicly. That brings us to a total of 6 known outlines, out of the 12 George has reportedly given Ira Parker. I think when you look at what happens after the events of the Mystery Night, large events such as the 3rd and 4th Blackfyre Rebellions really jump out at you. We know some big name characters such as Maekar, Aerion, Bloodraven, Aegor Rivers, Dunk and Egg all take part in them, with Aerion apparently doing something quite impressive during the 3rd. The 4th Blackfyre Rebellion also does have some really cool sounding battles in it. I think the reason the later Blackfyre Rebellions have yet to really be fleshed out in lore is simply because George plans to do it via the novellas. The same applies to the Peak Uprising. We know it's something George has said he wants to cover, and if you know the lore, it's vitally important in Egg eventually becoming king. Lionel Baratheon's rebellion, which I believe could be the outline known as the Champion, seems an area just waiting to have its story told, especially since how popular Lionel Baratheon has become as a character thanks to the TV show. I also suspect a novella about the Great Council of 233 could also make sense in a lot of ways. Lots of politics and the downfall of Bloodraven, with him getting sent to the wall, with Maester Aemon. Something I really think George would want to tell, given both of those characters' connections back to the main story of A Song of Ice and Fire. So when you take a step back and look at the bigger picture, there is a hell of a lot that can be covered in these outlines. The question really is, Does Ira Parker actually want to adapt these stories? Will he really want to carry on past the published novellas, knowing how poorly that's panned out for Game of Thrones? Before season 1 came out, I would have said he'd be mad to even try it. But in interviews during the airing of season 1, he very much suggested he really wanted to tell the story of Dunk and Egg's whole lives, kind of like George is doing with the novellas. He suggested they could take a break after a few seasons to allow for the actors to age up in order to tell these stories. The idea of them actually making 14 seasons over the next decade and a half is wild, and frankly it's actually hard to believe it's possible. Not only just keeping the actors involved in the project, but actually the idea of HBO commissioning that many seasons of a single show. But in the modern era of streaming, at the end of the day, money talks. So who knows what could happen. Parker is quoted as saying the following on the subject of going past the novellas. Even though we don't have the ins and outs of every story, we know canonically the major beats of Dunk and Egg throughout their lives. So we shouldn't necessarily run into the same trouble as the flagship did. And George has outlined 12 more of these stories that he shared with me. Parker then went on to tell The Hollywood Reporter in January 2026. These stories take them all the way through their lives. Some of them are just paragraphs, but they give you a sense of where they're going to go and the people who come back in and out of the story. This does kind of seem to indicate that as of now, it is Ira Parker and George R. R. Martin's intent to carry on the show past the 3 published stories. Furthermore, Ira has already discussed how writing these stories could work. He said, "George and I have talked very loosely that if it ever came to that, we would go through and break seasons together. That he has a lot of ideas and we can bounce off each other." He goes on to say, "Obviously, I don't want to take him away too long from his day job, but it's amazing how much can be accomplished in a quick amount of time with him and a couple of his favourite authors in the room. We were pretty good for season 1, so I think we could continue that and come up with some good stuff." So it does seem that if the show goes past season 3, they will be using these outlines, and that George R. R. Martin would be heavily involved in the writing of the seasons, or at least the planning of them. I recall when A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms was first announced, an idea started to become very popular among lots of big A Song of Ice and Fire creators here on YouTube. This notion that George very well knows that given his situation with the Winds of Winter, that it is extremely unlikely he has the time to be able to finish 12 more Dunk and Egg novellas, without it maybe becoming more of a Fire and Blood style history book, and that he might actually be using the expediency of a HBO show as a way to tell these stories he's outlined and be involved in finishing the story on screen rather than in print. That to him it could be some sort of compromise that, while not ideal, at least means he could finish the story. I never really brought into this concept, but after all these comments from Ira and George's seemingly heavy involvement in the show could indicate there's certainly some merit and truth to this idea. While they may not finish the story exactly, George could still get a lot more done than he would do under normal circumstances. He could, while allowing Ira a lot of freedom of approach, guide the general direction of the story in a way he wasn't able to do with Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon. The success of this, however, really relies on George's relationship with Ira Parker. We've seen what happens when George's working relationship with writers breaks down. With House of the Dragon, he was, after all, once full of praise for Ryan Condal, with their relationship now broken beyond repair. Who knows what could happen with Ira Parker once they move past the adapted outlines, which will require a lot more creative input from Parker than season 1 than when adapting straight from source material. It does seem that George and Ira do have this good working relationship, and I think with season 1, Ira Parker has proven he really does love Dunk and Egg, and George in turn really loved the show as well. So I'm hopeful that if it comes to adapting the outlines, they will work well together, and the show will still have the very DNA of George R. R. Martin's writing in it. Because at the end of the day, that's what made season 1 of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms such a pleasure to watch. It truly felt like I was watching the very text George R. R. Martin had written come to life on screen. The big question here as fans is, do we really actually want this? Is this something we're interested in watching? Yes and no. It's a really difficult question to answer, and I can only really speak for myself. But I have seen many echo my sentiment in the comment section over the course of the last month or so. I think it would make sense for Ira Parker and George R. R. Martin to carry on A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms once it passes the published novellas. But I personally feel they should just focus on the outline for She-Wolves of Winterfell and The Village Hero, given that we know that George has worked extensively on both these stories for well over a decade, and thus they are the most fleshed out in terms of the story. Especially when it comes to She-Wolves, given that we know he was actively writing the novella at some stage, before shifting focus to Fire and Blood, and now primarily The Winds of Winter. With those two outlines, and George's involvement, I can't see why these two stories would not work. After that, however, I have very mixed feelings. While I really admire Ira Parker's vision of following the whole lives of Dunk and Egg, adapting these other outlines George has given him, I'm not too sure how realistically practical this is, even with George being involved. There is no doubt that Ira Parker is a talented screenwriter, but Season 1 was a very close adaptation of the Hedge Knight, with very few deviations from the novella, while the original content Ira Parker added really did fit in well with the rest of the story. For example, Dunk's friendship with Lionel Baratheon and Raymond Fossaway, for example. It was still there to support the directly adapted material. I do wonder how Parker would fare when 90% of the story is now made up of original content. As much as I enjoyed Ira Parker's writing, we must remember there was a time when Benioff and Wise were talked about with the same reverence with Game of Thrones, only for their reputation to be left in tatters once they abandoned the book material. Hell, even after Season 1 of House of the Dragon, people were talking of Ryan Condal as the second coming, yet many fans have now soured, rightly or wrongly, on Condal. Going past the published novellas will always be a gamble, and we won't know the result until it's too late. I think if the circumstances are right, and George is deeply involved, there's no reason why post-novella seasons cannot be successful, and I would be excited to see what George has planned in his outlines, and get many of the blanks from this era finally filled in. But after being burned so badly with Game of Thrones, and arguably for some fans House of the Dragon as well, I can't blame people for being skeptical of this direction for A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. I will be making a follow-up to this video in a few weeks' time, so I really want to hear what you guys have to think about this, and how comfortable you would be with A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms adapting past the published novellas.